Last week, you had some superstar names like Deebo Samuel and Jonathan Taylor, Terry McLaurin, Cedric Tillman, and Tony Pollard bust in fantasy football, and it might have cost you your matchup. Well, in today's video, I'm bringing you 5 players that could do the same in week 12, guys that could cost you your matchup. I got bubble guts thinking about putting them into the lineup. My hit rate through 11 weeks is 69%. All right. First name that I am not loving this week is DeAndre Swift versus the Vikings. Now, of course, it goes without saying any of these guys could go off. I'm just going to tell you why I don't love their situation. The matchup for DeAndre Swift is not favorable. This is the second worst matchup for your running back in fantasy football when you adjust for schedule. I mean, let's look at this, right? Recently, superstar names like Breece Hall held to 37 total yards, 2.6 yards per carry, under 7 fantasy points. Jonathan Taylor, 59 total yards, 3.7 yards per carry, under 9 fantasy points. Recently, Tony Pollard had 29 total yards, 1.7 yards per carry, under 5 fantasy points. We have seen plenty of good running backs in fantasy who have had terrible days this year against the Minnesota Vikings defense. And you really want to attack the Vikings through the air. You don't want to attack them on the ground. They give up the fewest rushing yards per game in the NFL, and they give up the 5th most passing yards per game in the NFL. Every offense, when they are game planning against the Minnesota Vikings defense, they are trying to think about how to beat them, and they're not thinking about the run game typically. And I want to remind you how easy DeAndre Swift's schedule has been since week 5. He's been on an incredible run in fantasy football, but the schedule has been very helpful for him. And week 5, he had the Panthers, the best matchup. They give up the most points allowed when you adjust for schedule to the position. The Jags in week 6, the second most points allowed to running backs. In week 8, the Commanders, which are middle of the pack. In week 9, the Cardinals, a top 10 matchup for your running back. In week 10, the Patriots, a top 8 matchup for your running back. And we have seen DeAndre Swift in more difficult matchups to start the season bust a couple times. It's been much more difficult for him from weeks 1 to 4, right? Versus Tennessee, 3 yards per carry, 5 fantasy points. Versus Houston, 8 points, 1.3 yards per carry. Versus the Colts in week 3, 1.5 yards per carry, under 7 fantasy points. So it's not like we haven't seen DeAndre Swift bust. He's just had incredible matchups so far since week 5 or so. And this is also one of the lowest over-unders of the week. The only game on Sunday that has a projected point total under 40 total points. So I would be hesitant to start him. Here's the reality, and I know this. There are 6 teams on bye. There are so many superstar running backs not available. If you have to put him in there, I get it. He's your best option, all right? Just lower your expectations. But I'd rather play names like J.K. Dobbins this week, Rachaad White versus the Giants, Hubba Hubbard. I know Hubba Hubbard has a terrible matchup. I'd rather play him, honestly, versus the Chiefs. Ramondre Stevenson versus the Dolphins, and Brian Robinson. I'd rather play him this week versus the Giants, or the Cowboys, rather, is what I meant to say. But look, I get it. Swift could totally break off any play for a touchdown, but this is not a good matchup, and I don't think we want to target it if we have a better option. The second name that I don't think we should start, and a lot of people might get a little more confidence after last week, Anthony Richardson versus the Lions. Okay, 5th worst matchup for your quarterback in fantasy football. Remember, we had names like Dak Prescott, no touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 5 fantasy points. Jordan Love, who's been great this year, 270 yards, no touchdowns, and interception, under 9 fantasy points. CJ Stroud had a touchdown recently, but threw 2 picks, under 13 fantasy points. And they have the personnel in Detroit to stop Anthony Richardson's superpower, which is rushing the ball. Anthony Richardson, we know, 2 rushing touchdowns last week, but the Lions are a top 5 defense against the run. They give up the 5th fewest rushing yards per game, and they also allow the 5th fewest total points allowed per game to opposing offenses. That would sound a little weird, but you get what I'm saying, right? And I'm extremely happy for ARich. I really am. I mean, you never really want to see a young, talented guy who was drafted high bust. We don't want to see that. So happy he got the win last week versus the Jets. However, I would be hesitant to trust him in my starting lineup, especially in bad matchups like this one, until we see some more consistency, right? I mean, let's not forget that before Anthony Richardson was benched, he was, if you look at quarterbacks with at least 50 dropbacks, he was last in completion percentage, last in adjusted completion percentage. He had the 3rd worst PFF passing grade, and he had the 4th worst turnover-worthy play percentage In that time span, remember, before he was benched, he was 222nd out of 225 quarterbacks in completion percentage since the year 2000. So look, I get it, he had a good game, but I need to see that 3 weeks in a row before he goes into my starting lineup. I'd rather start Matt Stafford. I'd rather start Drake May, Russell Wilson. I'd rather start Tua Tags or Justin Herbert in a great game versus the Ravens. Bo Nix. I'd rather start these names this week. I just don't trust ARich just yet in that starting lineup. At number 3, I am sure that this will be received with love. I'm sure this will be received with rational takes on the internet. I don't want to start Hubba Bubba versus the Chiefs if you have a better option. I get it if you don't have a better option, but let's be honest for a second. This is about as bad as it gets for Hubba Bubba this week. The Chiefs are the worst matchup for your fantasy running back. We've seen so many fantasy running backs that we've relied on each and every week be shut down by the Kansas City Chiefs. Remember, Derrick Henry in week 1 had 3.5 yards per carry. The touchdown is the only reason he had over 10 fantasy points. Bijan Robinson, who has been a superstar this year, well, he was held to under 2 yards per carry. The touchdown, again, the only reason he had over 10 fantasy points. J.K. Dobbins was held to 2.2 yards per carry. He had under 10 fantasy points. Alexander Mattison, who was their workhorse at the time, under 1.5 yards per carry, under 10 fantasy points. The Chiefs defense right now gives up the 3rd fewest rushing yards per game. They allow the 3rd lowest yards per carry at 3.6, and they give up the 5th fewest total yards per game to opposing offenses. Here's the other thing we have to think about. What is the game script going to look like with Carolina and Kansas City? Well, the Panthers are the biggest underdogs of the week. They're currently 10.5-point underdogs, which could really limit Chuba's ability to establish the run in the second half. I get it, guys. If this is your best option, you got to put him in there. But I think there could be some better names out there this week. By the way, Jonathan Brooks is set to make his debut. So if Jonathan Brooks is going to play in this game, what will that take away from Hubba Bubba? I'd rather start Ramondre Stevenson versus the Dolphins. I'd rather start Brian Robinson. I'd rather start Aaron Jones if you have him, or a Tyrone Tracy. Those are the names I'd rather put into my lineup. I get it if you don't have a better option. At number 4, I don't want to start any non-Jaden Reed Packer wide receiver versus the 49ers. So anybody not named Jaden Reed, I don't want to start versus the 49ers. This is the 2nd worst matchup for your wide receiver in fantasy football. They are top 8 in fewest passing yards and total yards allowed per game. But more importantly, beyond the matchup, what really concerns me is the target share for the Packers this year. Guys, since week 5, check this out. It's been, snip, snap, a different guy pretty much every single week. In week 5, Dontavion Wicks led the team in targets with 13. He did the same thing in week 6 with 7. But then in week 7, it was Jaden Reed who led the way. But then in week 8, Romeo Doubs led the way. Romeo Doubs led the way in week 9. But then it was Christian Watson in week 10. And again in week 11, it was Christian Watson with 4 targets. And I think the rest of the guys had like 2 targets in that game. At least Jaden Reed gets like these layups written into the script, your end arounds, your screenplays. I just don't trust these guys on a week-to-week basis. Could be Romeo Doubs this week. Could be Christian Watson. Wicks could have a game. The reality is every week somebody's going to be good, but you can't predict who it is. If you have these names, I'd rather start them like a Quentin Johnston versus the Ravens, a Jerry Jeudy, a Wan'Dale Robinson, a Jacoby Myers, a Pop Douglas. I'd rather start these names this week. I think they are more reliable this week. All right, the 5th room, kind of group of players I don't want to start. The Raiders running backs versus the Denver Broncos. First off, it's a top 10 worst matchup for your running back. Kamara was shut down under 2 yards per carry against him, under 10 PPR points. Hubba Bubba was shut down under 4 yards per carry, under 10 points. Bijan Robinson had under 3 yards per carry, under 11 fantasy points. They're top 6 in fewest rushing yards allowed, in fewest yards per carry allowed, and in total yards allowed per game to opposing offenses. But beyond the matchup, really, beyond the matchup, because even if it was a good matchup, I don't think I would start these names. Who the hell do you even start for the Raiders? If you were like, well, the Raiders have a good matchup. Well, a lot of them are dealing with injuries right now. We don't know who's going to be healthy. But beyond health, even if they were all healthy, who the hell do you start? Like, for a while, it looked like Madison was the lead back. But since week 9, all 3 of these guys are getting opportunities. And Abdullah is actually the one who's leading the backfield in usage. You can see, again, shout out to, who is this? Fantasy Life, I think. They have a utilization report, which is great. And Amir Abdullah, since week 9, is the top back in utilization. Zamir's getting work. Madison's getting work. Abdullah's obviously making things annoying. Who the hell are we going to tell you to start? Even if Amir Abdullah's a starter and Madison and Zamir White are out with an injury or whatever the case may be, I don't think you can start it because of the matchup. But even if there was a good matchup and they're all healthy, it's just like, man, it's an absolute mess. Don't start these names. Start Jalen Warren instead, a Pacheco or a Kareem Hunt instead, a Nick Chubb, an Eckler, a Rico Dowdle, a Javonte Williams, a Justice Hill, or even a Gus Edwards. I just don't think that this is going to pan out for you. Okay, so those are 5. Actually, really, if you think about it, I had groups of people. So it's more like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or so players that I don't like this week. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Ultimately, I guess I have to say this every week, but I cannot predict the future. I'm telling you good rationale as to why I don't want to start these players, and you have to make the decision for yourself. Hopefully, you're able to do that with your lineup, and hopefully it was helpful. Hey, if you have a tough decision to make this week, check out the pinned comment. You can ask me a question at any time on our website. And if you don't have a free account on our website just yet, use the promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, when you sign up, and you will get access to the League Analyzer, the Expert Consensus Rankings, and the Trade Calculator, all for free when you use our promo code LAND. Appreciate you for watching the video. Hit that like button, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Much love. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.